It's a pleasure today to welcome Professor Simon Oliver as our speaker from the University of Durham. His first degree was in politics, philosophy and economics from Oxford, and then after spending some time in Zaire and Leeds, two rather different places on the globe, he came to Cambridge to study theology. He's an Anglican priest and a resident canon of Durham Cathedral. He's had appointments in a variety of different places, including Oxeter, Lampeter and Nottingham, and he moved to Durham in 2015 as the Van Milder Professor of Divinity. His research is focused on Christian theology and metaphysics, and particularly concerns the doctrine of creation. And he's going to speak to us today under the title of Consciousness, Intention, Final Causality and the Desire for God. Simon, very welcome.
Keith. Thank you very much indeed. And thank you for the invitation to be with you this afternoon. I'm sorry I don't have any fancy pictures to offer you, but I've gone for the traditional approach of having a paper handout. I hope you've got a copy of that. That will provide you with a few signposts as I go through the talk this lunchtime. Over the last 5 years or so, I've been particularly interested in the place of final causes or purpose in nature, particularly as this relates to the doctrines of creation and providence, but also the history and philosophy of the natural sciences. The study of final causes or goal orientation in nature is known as teleology, a term first coined in the 1720s by the German philosopher Christian Wolff. So let's be clear from the beginning what are final causes. When we say, for example, that the whale migrates in order to breed, the heart beats in order to pump blood around the body, or the student studies in order to learn, we are offering an explanation in terms of purposes or goals. Those goals are causal. They bring about processes and behaviors by establishing a purpose, and they help us to answer the question, why? Within the natural order, we observe purpose everywhere, whether it be in bees, birds, or babies. We ascribe purposive behavior preeminently to human subjects who can imagine, execute, and achieve their purposes with greater freedom from the constraints of instinct. In turn, we humans can impose purpose onto apparently purposeless materials by making tools or machines. Explanation in terms of final causes or purpose was fundamental in the natural philosophies of ancient Greece, particularly of Plato and Aristotle, as well as the theologies of creation in the patristic and medieval periods. One way in which we commonly narrate the transition from the ancient and medieval world to the modern world is through an alleged rejection of final causes or purpose in nature. The textbook History of Ideas suggests that from around the 16th century, the processes of nature were increasingly understood in terms of efficient causes rather than purposes or goals. Efficient causes are the kind with which we're quite familiar today. Put very simply, a push or a pull, a cause physically conjoined to an effect, or the action immediately preceding an effect in time. But a more careful look at the development of natural philosophy, or physico-theology as it was known in the 17th and 18th centuries, reveals that the story is a lot more complex. In 1620, Francis Bacon, one of the originators of the modern scientific method, declared final causes to be barren, except in the case of human affairs. I'll come back to that in a moment. Robert Boyle, in his A Disquisition about the Final Causes of Natural Things, published in 1688, declared that it is incumbent upon us to look for the final causes of creatures, lest we neglect their usefulness and fail thereby to admire and thank the author of them. So at this time in the late 17th century, it was very common to try and discern the purposes of things so that we could make use of them because God had given them to us with a certain functionality, if you like. These were gifts of God. So we need to work out why we have, for example, woodworm. That's a very a very common animal that they wrestled with. Why on earth has God given us this? What's the purpose of it? It was that kind of discernment of final causes they had in mind. But to cut a long story short, the story of the science of teleology was increasingly isolated from the nascent natural sciences through the 18th and 19th centuries. And it eventually came to be associated with a particular kind of natural theology focused on the supposed divine design of nature in the form of so-called teleological arguments for God's existence. Final causes, insofar as they were discernible, came to be understood as essentially extrinsic to an otherwise mechanical and purposeless nature. Purposes were thought to be applied to inert matter via the laws of nature, which were in turn decreed and policed by God. Now today, it seems to me, teleology remains a key fault line, maybe even the key fault line, between theology and the natural sciences. In any theology of creation and providence, some kind of purposiveness in the form of an orientation to God, to goodness, will be central to an intelligible understanding of nature. By contrast, for some in the natural sciences, the rejection of teleology is of the essence of science, because science constitutes a turn from metaphysics and any kind of supernaturalism. And this, I think, is more than a methodological choice or the mere bracketing of the supernatural, because many natural scientists would claim that purposiveness is simply not seen in nature from any legitimate rational perspective. It could be argued, this is for another paper and another book, it could be argued that purposiveness is not seen in nature precisely because of the way in which the ontology of nature has already been conceived a priori. So we might ask, in a bold moment, whether science is neglecting fundamental aspects of nature, purposiveness, goal orientation, that we nevertheless grasp very firmly at the level of intuition and common sense, a neglect that is perhaps less grounded in empirics than it is in metaphysics. Of course, the question concerning teleology becomes really acute in the area of human consciousness and intention. So when Francis Bacon declared 400 years ago that final causes are barren, he nevertheless admitted teleological explanation in the case of human affairs, because human conscious intention deliberates, identifies goals, and pursues those goals. So teleology comes to mark not only a fault line between science and theology, but also a fault line between humanity and nature. One can therefore also express the classic mind-body problem in terms of teleology. How can non-purposive, sottish matter give rise to intentional consciousness which rationally deliberates and seeks goals that explain action? That's the problem that's addressed, for example, by the American philosopher Thomas Nagel in his book Mind and Cosmos. That was published in 2012, and it received some very hysterical reviews because of its proposal that only a teleological account of nature, albeit an entirely naturalized teleology for Nagel, could allow significant progress in some of the most challenging areas of natural science. In reintroducing teleology in this way, Nagel, it seems to me, rightly attempts to subvert two options which remain relatively popular in the current mind-body debate. One is the alienation of the human from nature. Humanity is intentional and goal-orientated, nature simply isn't. Or the elimination of the human as we intuitively grasp ourselves as intentional, conscious and goal-orientated, the elimination of the human as we intuitively grasp ourselves via the proposal that conscious intention is simply an illusion or merely epiphenomenal. Now, the most interesting recent proposals in this debate link intentional consciousness to wider nature by proposing a kind of goal orientation or appetition all the way through nature, mind from top to bottom. I'm thinking particularly of philosophers such as the Canadian Evan Thompson. Such approaches tend to avoid locating goal orientation merely in the human will, but find it to be an expression of real natures, or what Aristotle would call the forms of things. So the German philosopher Robert Spemann, for example, he writes this, and the quotation's on your handout. Spemann writes, "We only know the meaning of tending towards something," so our own experience of our own goal orientation. We only know the meaning of tending towards something by association, that is, through our own experience. But not because we as active beings set ourselves goals, as if from nowhere, but because we find the direction towards goals beforehand within ourselves in the form of a tendency. So what Spamann's trying to say there is that our experience of goal orientation, I go into the middle of Cambridge to attend a lecture, is not simply a matter of the exclusively free human will selecting its own ends in a way that's devoid of determination in any sense, the determination of base instinct, for example, but rather that our ends are in some sense given to us by our natures and are there to be discerned. They're given to us through what Aristotle would call our dynamic substantial form. It's our experience of intention, of tending towards, stretching towards, striving for. It's there that we find our most immediate experience of teleological orientation. Now, for the phenomenological tradition of philosophy, going back to Edmund Husserl in the early 20th century, intention, the direction of mind, is of course the defining aspect of mind. So the American Orthodox theologian David Hart, in his book The Experience of God, he describes purposive intention as requiring even the most basic, as being required even for the most basic activity of sense perception. So he gives the straightforward example of picking up a cup, expecting to drink coffee, but instead drinking a mouthful of wine. The mental intention is met not with recognition, oh, that's coffee, but with cognitive dissonance. One doesn't immediately taste the wine, one experiences only confusion until one's intentional orientation is readjusted and one can taste the wine as wine and as an agreeable Sancerre or a tepid Chardonnay. So David Hart writes, this quotation's on your handout as well. The mind knows nothing in a merely passive way, but always has an end or meaning toward which it is purposively directed as toward a final cause. In every act of representation, the intending mind invests perception with meaning by directing itself toward a certain determinate content of experience, and by thus interpreting each experience as an experience of this or that reality. So Hart's there trying to make this basic phenomenological point that our minds are not simply passive recipients of the world, but are orientated towards the world as if it were a goal that's directing our intention, or to put it another way, our attention. Now the question I'd like to discuss this afternoon briefly in this paper concerns how we might begin to conceive this teleological mind, this goal orientation of our consciousness, to be present in some form, however analogous, throughout nature. Is there anything in the pre-modern conception of final causes that might allow us to think differently about purpose in mind and nature? I've argued elsewhere for the view that purpose is present in the form of appetition or desire right through nature, principally through Aristotle's notion of what he calls in Greek horexis, that arises even in the most basic of material natures. I'm going to pursue that line of thought, first of all, with respect to Thomas Aquinas' philosophy of action and intention. And we're going to see that Aquinas similarly considers nature to be intrinsically orientated in the direction of the good, but in a way that, although not deliberative in every instance, is nevertheless an expression of divine intention. What I hope we're going to glean from Aquinas is some sense of the sophistication of his view of goal orientation or teleology. Although teleology is frequently rejected in the natural sciences, it's not always clear what kind of teleology is being rejected. It may be that a variety, a particularly modern variety, is being rejected, and a more traditional view could be a more fruitful way of understanding natural causes and purpose that we so readily intuit in the natural world. But Thomas Aquinas is still going to leave us with something of a lacuna. How are conscious intentional purposes related to or communicated to matter? I can communicate my conscious intentional purposes to material natures by making an artifact, but that purposiveness remains external to the material artifact. Okay? It doesn't become that artifact's nature. And this is where I'm going to take a somewhat unexpected turn to consider another Aristotelian concept, hexis, or habit, that is used as a mediating concept between intentional consciousness and wider material nature, particularly in the work of the 19th century philosopher Félix Ravaisan. Now, some of you may be familiar with Ravaisan's work. He's only just being discovered in the English-speaking world. He was part of the French spiritualist tradition, born in 1813. He died in Paris in 1900. His doctoral thesis, with just a short essay entitled On Habit, was highly influential in the work of figures such as Martin Heidegger and Henri Bergson. So why habit? Well, let me offer you a quick hint. We all have habits, good and bad. Much of what we do every day, our morning routine, making coffee, eating a sandwich at lunchtime, driving to work, is done by habit without much conscious deliberation. Habit is controversial in modern philosophy. For some, habit dulls our senses to the wonder and beauty of things. You just don't notice King's College Chapel because you walk past it habitually every day. For others, habit is crucial in living the moral life because virtues are settled habits, ways of being. Now, habit is a crucial concept in Ravaisan's Aristotelian philosophy because it, in fact, refers to the way in which something holds or possesses itself. This is why we refer to religious as wearing a habit. Okay? It has the same same etymological root. It's a way of being, a settled way of being. So for Ravaisan, health or intellect are habits. Okay? A bird and a tree have a certain habitual way of being, of holding themselves. But Ravaisan's particularly interested in the fact that living creatures can acquire, or what he calls contract, new habits, and do so in an apparently intentional, conscious and teleological fashion. But habit for Ravaisan, so for example, let me give you an example, the habit of playing the piano or knowing science. Okay? For Ravaisan, those will be habits we can contract or acquire. But habit for Ravaisan isn't confined only to conscious, intentional subjects like human beings. We will see that habit is analogically present throughout the natural world, particularly in biological organisms. But intentional consciousness for Ravaisan is the archetypal instance of habit. On his view, the habitual nature of our intentional consciousness helps us to understand the way in which habit is present all the way down through nature, and he uses the image of a spiral staircase descending to the bottom of a building. And therefore, he describes the way in which mind is never alienated from matter, not even the depths of matter. The point here is that the primary desire that we find in intentional consciousness and the appetition we find in base matter, what Ravaisan calls will, our free intentional consciousness, and nature, the material world, need some kind of mediation. And he finds that mediating concept to be habit. Okay, I'll come to Ravaisan shortly. For the moment, I'd like to make a few comments about what Thomas Aquinas says, because he'll help us grasp what Ravaisan's all about. Aquinas famously stated that every agent of necessity acts for an end. Without the final cause, for Thomas, there would be no agency, at least no intelligible agency. The final cause is that for the sake of which an agent acts. And he doesn't just mean here human conscious subjects. He means any kind of agency in nature. So this would include inanimate substances as well for Aquinas. Aquinas notes that rational natures tend to an end, tend to a goal, as moving themselves to that end, whereas non-rational natures, everything from inanimate objects to lower animals, tend to an end as directed or led by another. Okay? Ultimately, what moves things to their proper end, including the inanimate, is, for Thomas, the divine rational art, which is not extrinsic, but is instilled within things by nature. So, in his commentary on Aristotle's physics, Aquinas makes clear that nature is an agent, but one that does not deliberate. But, as we'll see later with habit, this does not mean that nature is an irrational agent or one that doesn't act for an end. Quite the contrary. Nature does not deliberate for the same reason that a harpist doesn't deliberate when she plays the harp. That's a good example of a Ravesonian habit. A harpist doesn't deliberate when she plays the harp because the determinate means by which she acts has become second nature. It just flows from her. You know, when I'm playing the harp, I don't have to deliberate about every action of my fingers, okay? But that doesn't mean it being non-deliberative that it's therefore irrational or not goal-orientated. So Aquinas says this about the way in which habits or goals become settled in nature. He says this quotation is on your handout. And this quotation, I think, is very important, and it's particularly helpful in showing us how Aquinas' view of teleology differs so much from the kind that we find, for example, in William Paley's Natural Theology, published in 1802. So what Aquinas says is this: hence, since nature has the determinate means by which it acts, okay, it does not deliberate. For nature seems to differ from art only because nature is an intrinsic principle and art is an extrinsic principle. So if I make a machine like a photocopier, the principle of its action is extrinsic in me, the designer and the operator of the machine. Okay? It doesn't belong to the machine by nature. Whereas in the natural world, that goal orientation does belong to the natural kind. So he continues, hence it is clear that nature is nothing but a certain kind of art, the divine art impressed upon things, by which these things are moved to a determinate end. And then he says this: it is as if the shipbuilder were able to give to timber that by which they would move themselves to take the form of a ship. So what Aquinas is saying there is that when we make an artifact like a ship, we have to order the materials from outside, as it were. Okay? That's an extrinsic teleology. What he's saying is that God's creation of the world, he had inscribed those ends and the means to achieve those ends in the natures of things themselves, so they move themselves to that end. And that's the critical difference between a humanly designed artifact and God's creation. It is as if the shipbuilder were able to give to timber that by which they would move themselves to take the form of a ship. Now, this passage indicates the primacy of the divine art over human art and their radical dissimilarity. God can inscribe into the natures of things their goals and the means to achieve those goals. Okay? So the divine art enters into the very being of things because God is the source of that being, and those things are thereby created. The divine art of creation has its source in the divine ideas themselves. At the same time, the natures or forms of things by which they move and are moved are donated by God and are made to be intrinsic to a creature's being. In the case of human art, everything from cars to computers to sculptures, the teleology is more exclusively extrinsic, having its source in the human conscious intention, which can't infuse itself right into the being of things in the way that God's creative act does. So the explanation of action for Aquinas also requires the good to indicate why action tends to some ends and not others. Why do creatures try to achieve this end and not another end? An action is ordered to a particular end for Thomas because that end is good with respect to that which desires it. So he says in his treatise on truth, he describes this inclination, this action in the natural world, in terms of what he calls natural and violent motion. And those terms are a little bit confusing for us, but what he has in mind is simply this. A natural motion is one in which the moved body contributes something to that motion towards its goal. A violent motion is one whereby the natural body resists that movement, okay? So it's obviously a very, very different way of thinking about it compared to Newtonian mechanics. Okay, so natural and violent motion, natural motion towards the good of something, violent motion away from the good of something. So he writes this: it is after this fashion that all natural things are inclined to what is suitable for them, having within themselves some principle of their inclination, in virtue of which that inclination is natural, so that in a way they go themselves and are not merely led to their due ends. Things moved by violence are only led because they contribute nothing to the mover. But natural things go to their ends inasmuch as they cooperate with the one including and directing them through a principle implanted in them. All natural things, animate and inanimate, are inclined to a certain end by the prime mover, by God, for Thomas. So everything is inclined by nature to that which is intended by God, but the only intention appropriate to the divine will is God himself, who is good by essence. So everything is by nature inclined to the good and inclined towards the direction of God. Now, before I move to Ravesson, the final remark I should like to make about Aquinas' view of action and intention concerns power and the fundamental character of that action. You see, the way that Thomas thinks about action and power is not the way that we would do post-Newton. We would think of action and power in terms of the transmission of force. For Thomas, it's much more the communication of form. What does he mean by that? To act is simply to communicate that through which the agent is in act. So, for example, I am teaching a class of students, and what I am not doing is transmitting a force to them, but I am trying to communicate what Aquinas would call a form, the form of knowledge. So I'm trying to donate something rather than transmit a mere force. It's a very, very different way of thinking about it. But it does mean that every agent, me for example, tries to communicate a likeness of myself to my students. I communicate myself, that's the nature of my action, of what I am, by trying to donate something of my form, my nature, for example, knowledge of theology or philosophy. So that's really what Aquinas has to say about the way that form is communicated, and we'll come back to that idea when we talk about Ravesson in a minute. But just before I do move on to him, what I still think we're lacking in this picture of the transmission of form is some account of how the forms in conscious intention are mediated to material natures. Okay? So what I have in mind here is how do the desires that arise in my mind, how are they communicated to material natures, particularly through my body? Okay? So how does my mind communicate with my body such that I can acquire a new habit, for example, playing the piano? How does my conscious mental intention communicate through my materiality to enable my learning, for example? So can we give an account of this conscious intention, this innate desire that I've been talking about? Can we give an account of the way in which that is communicated with material natures and gather those material natures to achieve that goal? And that's the slight gap in Aquinas that I think we can try and fill in with Ravesson. So, Ravesson's understanding of habit, I'm keeping an eye on the time. Ravesson's understanding of habit is an extension of Aristotle's view of in moral psychology. Virtue, for example, is a kind of habit. He extends it into natural philosophy and into metaphysics. Habit refers to the way that something is or literally holds or possesses itself. A habit requires an organic unity which can both possess and acquire habit as a permanent way of being. Now, Ravesson is particularly concerned with how habit is contracted through change, given that creatures that have habit have a settled and permanent way of being, as a tree or a person, for example. So, he starts his treatise by remarking that if one were to throw a ball in the air 100 times, it would still not acquire the habit of moving upwards. Okay? A photocopier does not have a habit because it is a mechanism without a unifying organic form and requires an external efficient cause for its operation. If you unplug it, it ain't going to work. Okay? A habit seems to imply not simply changeability, but the ability to assimilate that change, which may originate extrinsically, to assimilate that change into an intrinsic second nature. So all the way through it, think about learning to play a musical instrument. Let's try that example now. So here's a particularly clear and straightforward instance of acquiring a habit for Ravesson, learning to play the piano. So to begin with, the movements of one's hands are deliberate and a focus of conscious, laboured reflection at every moment. So my conscious intention has to go through my arms and my fingers very deliberately at every moment as I learn to strike the keys. So at that time, the conscious intentionality orientated towards playing the piano, that's its goal, is very obvious. After some months of practice, one becomes habituated to playing the piano. The music flows easily and delightfully. It becomes what Ravesson calls second nature. But one is not dulled to the business of playing the piano. On the contrary, the concert pianist is more aware of herself playing the piano precisely because this is the actualization of her potential to play the piano, and it becomes an expression of a new nature, the piano player. So as consciousness loses itself with respect to will, in other words, I don't have to deliberate when I've gained a certain expertise in playing the piano, it gains itself, the self gains itself all the more in the awareness of its nature as it's playing the piano, fulfilling that nature, actualizing that nature. It's one of the things I love doing in the cathedral at Durham is watching our organists play the organ. Controlling 4 limbs in that way is quite extraordinary, it seems to me. I could never do it in a million years. But of course for them it is almost effortless, you know? Daniel Cook will sit and play you Vidor with no score in front of him, and it's absolutely incredible to watch. But that's what Ravesson means by a kind of second nature, a settled way of being that's not easily lost. Okay? So to take another example, a bird doesn't deliberate about whether or not to fly, but flight is the expression of the bird's nature, and in flight it is most bird-like. Flight springs spontaneously, or Aquinas happens to put it, sweetly and delightfully from a bird's nature. And this is what Ravesson's really fascinated by. One of his most important contributions concerns the development of what he calls the double law of habit. What he means by this is the following. It's a play on this opposition between habit's tendency to dull our sense of the world, to be really make us passive, and its contrary ability to heighten attention, to be active. When we become accustomed to certain experiences or sensations, we are passive and we fail to notice them, walking past King's College Chapel. Alternatively, the constant repetition of movements, learning to play the piano, for example, become easier and easier and the source of real delight as they are active. Now, Ravesson explains this active-passive double law via the example of 2 people who drink rather a lot. One who gets drunk and the other who, like us, is a wine expert. So Ravesson's point is that the senses of the person who gets drunk have become dull to the wine because they drink by a passive habit. Perhaps they drink whilst watching the television or chatting in the pub to a crowd of friends. They barely notice that a bottle and a half of Cabernet Sauvignon has gone. The wine expert is active. She looks at the vintage, assesses the suitability of the glass, examines the wine in the sunlight, tests its bouquet, savours the flavours. Sensation is intensified by active repetition, and the skills of wine tasting are honed and become habitual in a much more active sense. They are subject to knowledge and judgment and intention. In fact, there is a sense in which we need both kinds of habits really for everyday life, active and passive. Without passive habits, the ability to go through the morning routine without really noticing, our lives will become very, very saturated indeed. We'd never get out the front door. Our passivity frees us for other more conscious and deliberate activities in other spheres, other habitual activities. But the key point for Ravesson is that habit becomes a kind of mediator between conscious mental intention and the material in the following way. When I learn to play the piano or speak a language, there's another example of the acquisition of a habit, such habits become natural, sweet and delightful. But this is not merely a mental habituation, because the body is also involved in playing the piano or speaking a language. By the gradual acquisition of habit, my conscious mental processes are drawing together my physical corporeal processes. I am, in a very important sense, thinking and being intentional and teleological with my whole body. More to the point, my body is in a kind of tense engagement with my conscious intention. My hands may hurt through constant piano practice, for example. So the mind and the body are entirely one and yet dialectical in tension in their movement towards the acquisition of a second nature, for example, being able to play the piano or learn a language. And eventually, the two will settle under a newly acquired habit or second nature, a new formal unity, a new what Aristotle would call energeia, actuality. But the point for Ravesson is that habit is a mediating category in the sense that it changes voluntary deliberative movements into involuntary or instinctive movements, when I've learned to play the piano, by tiny imperceptible degrees. It makes thought to be corporeal and therefore reveals the continuity between my will, I want to learn to play the piano, and my material nature. For Ravesson, habitual movements are intelligent and rational, by which he means they are teleological, even when they cease to be entirely voluntary, an act of the will at every moment, as it were. So every human function, descending to the depths of unconsciousness, is for Ravesson characterized by a spontaneous or unreflective intelligence, a way of holding itself as an intelligible unity. It is teleological in the sense that the organism's goal is its way of being, and its way of being ecstatically more than itself in its ability to acquire new habits. So he writes this quote is on your handout. Ultimately, it is more and more outside the sphere of personality, beyond the central organ of the will, that is to say, within the immediate organs of movement, that the inclinations constituting the habit are formed and the ideas are realized. Such inclinations, such ideas become more and more the form, the way of being, even the very being of these organs, such as my hands. The picture we have, therefore, is habit as present at every level of the continuum between will and nature, between conscious mental intention and the materiality of the body. Because every biological organism for Ravesson really has a habit, a way of holding itself in being as a this rather than a that, as something stable and continuous, a unity that's intelligible. That's what he means by habit. It doesn't just belong to intentional consciousness, but intentional consciousness in us can mediate this to the materiality of our bodies. It renders the whole rational, teleological, in a fashion that can't be reduced to mechanical causes, because the acquisition of habit requires repetition that's continually non-identical, non-mechanical, by tiny imperceptible degrees. Think of learning to play the piano, so that issues in a new second nature, which is nevertheless in continuity with the first nature, the boy who couldn't play the piano, by the mediation of habit, the acquisition of habit. So the thought here is that at one level, habit is deliberative and voluntary as one learns to play the piano, but the exercise of that voluntary deliberation includes the use of habits, the habits of our body, muscle contractions, for example, that are not voluntary and are much more fundamentally settled. Habit mediates between these levels and mediates our will, I want to learn to play the piano, into nature, our bodily ability to do so. And what is true of human habituation from conscious intention to the base habits of my body is for Ravesson true of nature as such, because he thinks intention is present in some way all the way down. So he says this quotation again is on your handout. The final degree of habit meets nature itself. Hence nature is, as this final degree, merely the immediation of the end and the principle, the reality and ideality of movement, or of change in general, the spontaneity of desire. What he means by that is that natural entities seek a stable way of being as a goal for themselves, and that becomes habitual, in a way that the human being seeks a stable way of being as a piano player or a language speaker. So the final comment concerning the spontaneity of desire, that's all the way through nature, a desire to have a settled way of being for Ravesson, is the answer to an important aporia. To put the question succinctly, this is where Ravesson thinks that nature is really mysterious and where he thinks that there is an aspect of the divine. From where does the habit of forming habits arise? Okay, so an odd question. Where does the habit of forming habits arise? Why is it that living entities seek this settled way of being, are good for themselves? What is it that orders them to the acquisition of habits in this way? What motivates the changeability of biological entities? Ravesson's answer is that this nature, this natural world that is God's creation, is suffused with a spontaneous desire, which is in us the source of our will, the fact that we will for ourselves a settled way of being. The intrinsic and irreducible habit of desire or horexis, which for Ravesson is nature itself. So I'm almost out of time. I'm going to end with one or two very quick comments. The question of teleology that I've been skirting around this afternoon is so central to the debate about the relation of the natural sciences and metaphysics and theology, about mind to matter, about how we characterize, describe and understand the natural world. Teleology also makes evident some of the problems, perhaps even the crises that confront the natural sciences today, not least the apparently irreducible nature of teleological explanations in certain fields. I think it's very challenging, it seems to me. I'm not a biologist, of course, I'm not a medic, but it seems to me quite challenging to explain phenomena like the immune system entirely non-teleologically. But the problem of how one conceives a universe without a notion of cosmic teleological order, the problem of unified intentional consciousness that's goal-orientated, all these questions come to the fore. There are many different kinds of teleologies, some of them doubtless inimical to a rational and coherent understanding of nature or of God. But it seems to me that in the case of Ravesson, what we find there is a concept such as habit that is quite useful for alerting us to certain characteristics of the natural that might otherwise escape us, certain characteristics of action and intention, the communication of forms and real natures that might sometimes escape us, that do alert us to a certain kind of teleological order, settled ways of being that natural entities seek for themselves and indeed for others all the time. Thank you very much indeed for your patience and your attention.
you very much, Simon. And we've left some time for some questions. A few moments to pause while you get your minds together. I see a hand up already. And Ruth will bring the microphone round. Just there in front of you.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for your astonishing lecture. I wanted to ask about how you would respond from a Thomistic standpoint to Kant's critique of teleological judgment. Now, I believe he doesn't fall upon this modern dichotomy between extrinsic and intrinsic teleology. He rather critiques the way that we would understand any attempted judgment of any system as teleological. And if I recall correctly, his specific criticism is that teleological judgment requires that there's a kind of circuitous causation from the end to the beginning that motivates every procession of causation. And he finds this to be counterintuitive, if not paradoxical. And I take it that Ravasant can be taken as a way of eliding Kant's critique by reasserting a kind of realism about teleology in the habitual operations of material nature. But that elision doesn't respond to the critique, it merely avoids it. So I wonder if you might be able to respond to that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. You asked the straightforward question. Yes, I agree. He probably does avoid it. So Kant in the third critique, the real problem, and in fact, this may be more pertinent. Whether Kant is a teleological thinker or not is a moot point. So for some interpreters, yes, he is thoroughly, for others not. The standard reading of Kant is that teleology is a heuristic device in our understanding of nature. It's useful, and we naturally perceive things as teleological. You know, we just perceive evolution in goal-directed terms. But Kant is very ambivalent about, rather agnostic about whether it is teleological or not. He doesn't think that there's a stance from which we could make a judgment one way or another. So he says that it's a heuristic device in our understanding of nature principally because we are ourselves goal-orientated, so we read nature that way, okay? So what he's really worried about is that when we see goal orientation, we're just projecting. Yeah, we're just projecting. We're imagining it's there, but in fact, whether it is there or not, we can't tell because we have no stance from outside of ourselves to make that judgment, as it were. So he's not quite, let me just be clear, he's not making the sort of Dawkins point that, oh, it looks goal-orientated, but in fact we know it's not. What he's saying is it looks goal-orientated and we don't know whether it is or it isn't. Now, where I do think that someone like Ravasant is helpful is that he does try to give us an account of the way in which the goal orientation of mind is somehow analogically reflected in the natural world in ways that are not univocal with the way that our minds work, but somehow related to them by analogy. So he's not offering, for example, any kind of panpsychism. So he doesn't think that this music stand is conscious, but he is interested in trying to answer this question: is mind simply a fluke occurrence in a dark corner of the universe that is basically mechanical, non-purposeful, and irrational and sottish matter? And if it's not, if mind is not simply a fluke occurrence, but is somehow not inimical to material nature, what's the relationship between the two? And that's what Thomas Nagel's trying to get at in his book Mind and Cosmos, is how do we account for the occurrence of mind and consciousness? And one answer is, well, we just deny that mind and consciousness are real. There are some people who are so wedded to their reductive materialism that they'll deny their own consciousness. Okay, this is not uncommon. On the other hand, we might want to say, well, mind and matter are essentially inimical to each other. We just don't understand how one gives rise to the other. I don't think that that's a pleasing answer either. So this concept of habit is trying to mediate between those two. Of course, it's very descriptive, it's very imaginative, but it is trying to give some sort of place to a basic observation that things have a settled way of being, and they seek that way of being. Ryan, you did ask about the circularity, the end and the beginning. I mean, that does seem to be a critical problem, but I think that metaphysically it's answerable, because I think that in the beginning is the end and in the end is the beginning. the protology and the eschatology are one and the same, and that's how I'd answer that. But that would take another hour and a half, probably, or 2 hours. But I think that's sort of where we're going.
Lydia there, and then Peter at the front here.
Could you give an example for a habit in the natural world? Because I see the point for a piano player,
Yeah.
perhaps even for higher animals, but what could be a habit for, say, a stone or rabbit or...
Okay, so it's much easier with biological organisms, but so we think of habit very much in terms of things that we do by rote. What he means is the tree outside has a settled way of being, okay, and a way of flourishing. It flowers at certain times of the year. It drops its fruit at other times of the year, and it will always resist any tendency to move it from that, okay? And so, for example, if we cultivate a plant, what we're doing is we're trying to shift it from one habitual mode of being to another habitual mode of being, for example, growing in a certain direction. So what he's interested in is this double law whereby things are kind of resistant to change. They will, so, you know, your child is resistant to learning French, for example. But any biological entity has a settled habit, a way of holding itself and being. It's resistant to change, but nevertheless, it has the ability to acquire that change, to assimilate that change, to have a new settled way of being. This is what he's interested in. So we can, for example, manipulate natural organisms in certain directions from one stable way of being to another stable way of being. Okay, and indeed, things can. He's thinking perhaps. I mean, he's thinking perhaps in basic evolutionary terms as well about the kinds of change that happen in nature from settled modes of being through selective pressures to other settled modes of being. So it's really about how things are stable and identifiable as a this rather than a that, and how you get from one biological organismic mode to another, and what it is about nature that allows that change. And then he will have a question about change in certain directions and not in others.
It seems to me you need to be careful about identifying a final causation with purposes. If I have a purpose, for example, I purpose to come to Cambridge to listen to you talk, that purpose is there and it is an effective cause for what I do that day.
Mm-hmm.
If it were a real final cause is something that pulls and is harder to identify, perhaps I might say to Aquinas, I don't really know why I want to be good. And he would reply, it's your final destiny in heaven which is pulling you. But overall, you didn't say too much about final causes in your talk, but rather more about purposes.
Okay, so this is an important distinction. If we talk about a final cause as pulling us, we're really talking there about a kind of efficient causality. So the metaphor is important. I am being pulled. Okay, there is a sense in which your purpose in coming to the lecture is metaphorically pulling you. There is a desire there that's drawing you. Yep. There is something that is attracting your attention here. Yep. You seem unconvinced.
I'm not convinced.
Tell me why I'm wrong.
You talk about it drawing me,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really pushing me.
It's really pushing you. Why? Why is it pushing you?
now
What's the difference?
That would be a matter of psychology and many things.
It would be okay. Well, there is a purpose in the sense that there is something you want to achieve that is not yet achieved. Would that be the case?
Yes.
Yes.
A desire.
A desire. So something that is not yet achieved that you want to achieve, but nevertheless you somehow, that goal is already somehow present in you, okay? So you can discern it as a goal that is desirable and that you want to attain. So maybe we can settle on, we can agree on a push and a pull. We'll be good Anglicans and go for the via media. But the point about final goals is that they are a matter of desire for both Aristotle and Aquinas. And he doesn't think that desire is something that belongs simply to conscious intentional subjects. I mean, I agree it's there for you, and you seek it because you want it, because you desire it. Descartes critiqued teleological thinking and final causes because he says, how can you seek a goal if you don't already know the goal? How can you seek a goal if you've not already attained it, as it were? That, I think, is fairly easily answered, because you seek this lecture not as something you have yet attained, but you know what it would be to attain it, and that's the source of your desire and your goal. But I don't know that I quite grasp the business of it pulling you. It attracts you. Yeah, it does attract you. It is a mode of desire. That's final causation, as far as I know.
Take one from Dennis, and then we'll see if we've got a chance for one afterwards.
I was just interested in the number of times where you reflected on the challenge of these various thinkers of translating the mind into physical changes and so forth. And I'm just thinking, in biology that's easy. I mean, in a sense, as you didn't reflect on the biology there, but I mean, there's just so. Just thinking of brain scanning of people who played the piano after a few months, there are changes, synaptic connection. Taxi drivers in London, all these various examples, epigenetics. You have been influencing my genome since I've been sitting here, so that some synaptic connections are a little bit stronger, I hope. So I just wondered how much you're engaging with biologists on this, because I think it would be a very fruitful conversation.
Well, thank you, I mean, for sure. That was really what I was trying to move towards. But interestingly, I mean, brain scans of piano players, London taxi cab drivers who've taken the test show physical changes in the brain. The question is, which comes first? The physical change in the brain or the knowledge of how to drive around London? And the relationship between the acquisition of that knowledge and the brain change seems to me to be rather more complex than we often think it is. It's because it's not the case, is it? Surely can't be the case that you develop an area of the brain and then as a result acquire the knowledge. Could it be the other way around? Can
I give you a response?
Sure.
Well, I think the normal response to that would be to measure before the taxi drivers start something at all. They have a desire to become a taxi driver, they have a desire to pass the exam, to learn all those, and you can do the brain imaging. And then you have, after a few months of doing all that stuff, that's when you see the changes in the brain. So I would have thought, the sequence is fairly clear, actually.
Yeah, but what causes the knowledge? So you've got the knowledge, you've got the brain development. What's the causal connection between the two? Does the knowledge cause the brain development? Does the brain development cause the knowledge? Or are they one and the same? If they're one and the same, what's the relationship between them? Do you see?
Well, I could go on, but
I won't. I mean,
well, the neural correlates. Everything has a neural correlate all the time, and so there's a progressive, iterative process surely going on all the time in that process. But it has to start with intentionality at the beginning to get the whole thing off the ground.
Sure, absolutely. So absolutely.
And I'm going to draw us to a close there on that point. I think there might be some opportunity for further informal discussion afterwards. But will you join me in thanking Simon for stimulating us?
Thank you.